And we are live.
Woo.
So, woo, yeah. Now you should see the applause is from the audience. Yeah, so welcome everyone. This is our probably close to our 20th event this year. I don't even know. Like we had a lot of these online meetups at JSHeroes. Super happy to get the community together once every few weeks. This week we have another special guest we invited. One of the speakers that was supposed to be in April 2020 in Cluj, but it didn't happen, unfortunately. But we are very fortunate that Stefan was kind enough to join us for this session today. He has a very interesting talk he wants to share with the community. Now, for those who don't know him, Stefan is a DevRel at Contentful. He was a speaker at JSHeroes 2018, I think. That was, 2 years ago, 2 years and a half. And again, he was supposed to be again in 2020. And just one small insight about him. If you are not following him on Twitter, you should definitely go follow him. I think he's one of the people that shares the most interesting content when it comes to really like all these small little tricks about web development. He has, tons of different things from dev sheets, tiny helpers. Today I learned, I at some point I lost count, but I always welcome all the bits of information that I get from his tweets. So make sure you follow him on Twitter. And yeah, Stefan, the stage is yours.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a bummer that we couldn't do last year, but we already, I'm looking forward to JSHeroes when we all can come together in the future. And here now, I would like to do a long rant about web development. So before I start, I have to say that I'm a JavaScript fanboy. In the next 30 minutes or 35 minutes, I really just want to question a little bit what we're doing lately. And the talk is called, Did Web Development Lose the Right Direction? So this is a talk about general best practices. And Alex already introduced myself a little bit. I'm Stefan. I work for Contentful, which is this content platform which provides you an API if you want to run your Jamstack sites and want to have an editor interface or something like this. And I was also already asked why I don't look like this today. Maybe the next time. So this is when I spoke at JSHeroes the first time, and there were a few people that decided to go on stage in a onesie costume. So I usually don't look that angry though. I just picked a random screenshot, but it was a lot of fun. I had a fabulous time at JSHeroes at that time. And I started web development basically 10 years ago, and let's talk a little bit about the state of web development at the time when I started. So I worked at TV initially, and I mixed TV shows. So I sat in front of this massive mixer, and then I became a developer. And when I did my first internship in an e-commerce business, this was the tech stack that I was confronted with. So it was a MySQL database, it was an Apache server, it was all running on PHP. And I was already like, that is a lot of stuff to learn. And then this Magento shop, which it was at the time, slowly but surely moved more things into the front-end layer. And what we had at the time was Prototype and jQuery. So for the people that do web development long enough, Prototype is basically more or less the same as jQuery, but we had both of them for legacy reasons in there. So then we had the Magento shop, and then this thing came up that was called Backbone, which initially brought more layers into the front-end stuff. Best practices started to evolve in the front-end because developers understood that there's a lot of cool stuff possible in the browser. So what you see here is YSlow, which was a collection of best practices to deliver fast and good web experiences. And I was completely hooked by this whole development thing, and probably I still am. And what do you do when you're a developer? You start blogging, or at least you try to start blogging. So this was my first blog. It's called Vorwaisenkinder.de. It was myself and 3 friends, and we wanted to just become bloggers. I think we made it to 8 posts in total then at the end. Everything was running on Jekyll, and it's still online, but I'm not posting there anymore. And then I think there was this one moment when things changed drastically, and that was with Grunt and Gulp. So this was what I did to the moment of Grunt and Gulp, was that there were some custom main build processes that were mainly minifying and concatenating JavaScript files. And with Grunt and Gulp and these new tools, it became very almost required to have complex front-end development tool chains in the projects that I was building. Then I did AngularJS, so the first version for a little bit. And on the side, I played around with React and Vue. And yeah, what shall I say? I mean, I'm wearing a JavaScript hat here. I really love the technology. And even though I hate it sometimes, I still love that things evolve that quickly. So I dropped the blog with my friends because I was the only person actually writing there. And then I started blogging on my own site. So what you see here is my own blog. You see that there are some fancy transitionings going on. It was built with a common JavaScript framework. It is statically pre-rendered. Oh, there was actually also Cluj in there when I recorded that. Did you see that? And I used this blog from 2017 to 2020 and was fairly happy with it. So if in case you are monitoring how this stuff actually is on a kind of performance and accessibility and quality scale, what you can use is you can go into Google Chrome and they ship a tool that is called Lighthouse. And you see there that my blog at the time was fairly green. So it had a 90 performance score, best practices, almost green, but accessibility and SEO, 100%, all good. I felt good about this. If you care about web performance, you might also know this tool. So what you see here is web page tests. This is a tool where you can dump in your website or URL and it gives you a bunch of performance metrics. So you see there that I had a speed index of a second, which means that the majority of the site on a good connection was visible after 1 second. And even on a 3G connection, the speed index was around 4 to 3 seconds. And I felt good about this. And when you look at Lighthouse scores, there's this rule that usually on the top 5 of the performant websites, when you have a score over 90. So it was on a good spot there, right? And of course, there was a lot of stuff included in there, a lot of complexity. I shipped the whole blog with HTTP2, which is now more or less a common standard. Everything was compressed, minified. I shipped a no module and module bridge to ship not polyfilled JavaScript for modern browsers. I had special font handling there with font display swap. I preloaded a bunch of things. And of course, I had several bundles. Everything was super nicely splitted so that I only ship to the browser and the users what they actually care about. And then one thing happened. Then I saw this website. This is a random website from Italy. And this was trending on Hacker News actually. And when, I don't know how you feel about that, but when I click around there, there's one thing, it feels super snappy. And the fact here is that it's still maintained. So there are a lot of GIFs and it looks very 90s, even maybe, I don't know, it looks very 90s. But when you then look under the hood, the HTML is not great. There are a lot of GIFs in there. But what happens when you run Lighthouse on this site? So what happens now is that this site is not performing great in accessibility best practices or SEO, but it's beating my site big times. And I spent hours and hours and hours tweaking and optimizing my own site. And even the blog that I mentioned beforehand, which I built when I was a developer with 1-2 years of experience using Jekyll, and I had no clue what I'm doing, was outperforming my cutting edge website that is built on modern technologies. So I went back to web page tests. And in case you don't know, you can also go to webpagetest.org/video and you can just paste a few URLs and then you get a video like this. And these 2 sites were actually faster than what I did with all my front-end engineering engineering knowledge. So you could now say, Stefan, you just messed it up. And honestly, I think that could be. But the question that I want to ask you is, how can it be so easy to mess up? So when we have a detailed look at these three websites, then you see that, oh, and I have to move the window here a little bit because I don't see my, okay. Then you see that my site ships overall way more resources. When you look at the index HTML that I ship, it is huge. The CSS resources are more or less the same. But when you then look at the JavaScript resources, is that I'm shipping way more stuff for maybe a similar experience. Image resources don't really matter in here. And then all these kind of numbers add up to this worse speed index of my site. So when you look at the speed index and how it is calculated, you will see here that it is a combination basically of a lot of different things. And the speed index just changed a few months ago, how it was calculated. So in the newest Lighthouse version, this is how it is calculated. So it is 15% first contentful paint, which is the first thing that has a meaning on the screen. Then it's 15% time to interactive, which means that all the JavaScript is downloaded and parsed. Then 50% of the speed index, which is kind of the completeness of the screen. Then the largest contentful paint, which goes for this bumpy experience, right? You don't want to have images kicking in so that you click the wrong thing. Then we have 20% time or consideration there of the total blocking time. And then we have cumulative layout shift, which also goes for this bumpy experience. And when you look at these metrics, you will see that actually 40% of these are bound to JavaScript, because JavaScript is single-threaded and it runs on the main thread. If you ship a lot of JavaScript, this will block and harm the user experience. If you want to learn a little bit more about how Lighthouse works and how this whole thing is calculated, Carolina wrote a very nice blog post there on the Calibre blog, which is also another web performance monitoring tool. And Paul Irish published this Lighthouse scoring calculator that you can check out. So if you wonder what it takes to get from 92 to 93, you can tweak and play around with these numbers and you will find out how you can have a better Lighthouse score. So these JavaScript resources and these JavaScript numbers are important because this is the effect or the impact of JavaScript. So what you see here is two websites that are loaded. And due to the fact that they ship static HTML, it looks like they are ready, but they are not. They are unresponsive. And depending on the connection or the device that your users are on, this can really affect the overall user experience, because a normal non-technical user does not understand why this button click doesn't work. And when you have a look at some statistics on how long it actually takes. So what a lot of people do, and this is probably sometimes myself included, is testing JavaScript execution times on fairly recent devices. This is far away from being the reality. And what you see there is a blog post by Tim Kadlec, who does a lot of web performance stuff. And you see here that the JavaScript execution CPU time for example, for React projects ranges from 5 seconds to 20 seconds due to low-end devices. And I want to ask you the question, do you wait 20 seconds for something to become responsive? I really have to want to see to wait that long. And then there are kind of examples like, for example, Netflix, and they had something in their login flow, which was a client-side React application. And they found out that when they dropped this and they went with some vanilla JavaScript, because when you think of it, a sign-up form is a little bit of validation. It's a little bit of Ajax, if you want to do that. You don't necessarily need a framework for that. And they found out that they could drop the time to interactive by 50%. And when you're building something like Netflix, the sign-up experience is extremely important for you, because this is why you're building this and get people in the platform. And when you look at the overall page rate, you always have to consider that 150 kilobytes of an image is nothing compared to 150 kilobytes of JavaScript, because JavaScript has to be downloaded, executed, and parsed. Page rate is not equal page rate. So I showed you my very, very heavy index HTML file. So when I initially released my new blog redesign, I tweeted it out, and a person, so I hang out on Twitter, as Alex said, right? So a person showed up and was like, 300 kilobyte in your HTML file. What are you doing? And what I did basically is that I argued myself into or out of this discussion, because I told the person that it was a very modern tech stack. It follows best practices for the current JavaScript ecosystem. And after gzipped, it doesn't matter anymore anyways. So basically what I did there is that I said, it's great because it's fast and it's still lighter than the rest of the internet. But now when I look back a few years, what I actually did at that moment was like, I'm just really digging the tech stack. And I tried to argue myself and make a point for this architecture for a blog, which is static content. So what was in there? So I had, this is the initial page at the time 2 or 3 years ago. And what was in there? Something like this. So this is a common architecture for universal or isomorphic JavaScript apps. So you run JavaScript on the server, you use some data, and then you have to tell the client JavaScript what data was actually used to render this HTML. So what I decided is that I inlined and preloaded 22 articles with an average session length of 1.1 pages. And why did I do that? I did that for better performance, just so that it is super snappy initially. And then now I feel like when you have a technology stack like this, it is very, very hard to make a very snappy website, like the website from this Italian person with a lot of GIFs in there. But I want to question you here, is it really that hard? So Phil Hawksworth from Netlify, he is one of the big Jamstack ambassadors. He usually says that he builds fast websites, and the only thing that he does is that he's not adding something that makes it slow. And he says that the work was usually done before you got there. There's not much to happen or to do inside of the client side. And I took this approach then with another side project, which was tinyhelpers.dev. So I found out that I had a lot of bookmarks of little online tools that you usually don't discover, because these online tools don't rank high in Google because they're just a simple tool. So I built this collection of online tools. So if you're looking for tiny helpers, you can check that out. And I built this with 11T, and look at this performance score. It is 100% full stack. And the thing with 11T is that it is one of these new static site generators that doesn't add all this overhead that usually comes with the current JavaScript ecosystem. And Zach Lead, who is maintaining 11T, he also has this 11T performance leaderboard. And you see here that 11T sites usually have a median Lighthouse performance score of 100. And this is just because 11T is pure. It doesn't come with all the things that makes websites slow. So a few years ago, I was giving a talk and I had this statement on stage in front of a few hundred people. And I said that every website is a web app and every web app is a website. Well, guess what? It's now 2020 and I couldn't disagree more with past me. Because where's the user's benefit of such overhead? So let's dive deeper a little bit into this topic and look at the common best practice of universal JavaScript apps for content websites. So when I started, there was this thing out there that was called HTML5 boilerplate, which was kind of this bootstrapping template that you used with a lot of best practices. And it had some HTML and had two script files, which were the main or vendor file and a plugins file. So this was all it had. And now in 10 years, we switched to something like this, to several bundles, several inlined data points, everything, a little bit of preloading. And the main reason, as I already mentioned, is that the reason for that is that the same code runs on the server and on the client. And now after doing this for several years, I'm still super stoked about this, because I think technically it is beautiful. But this also means that the same code runs on the server and the client. Your content for blog sites, for newspaper sites, for all these kind of things that are not actual applications, your content is in HTML and your content is in one form or another in JavaScript. You're basically duplicating everything. And I want to ask you if this is really the best way for the user. Another argument for these kind of architectures is it's super nice because it opens doors to progressive enhancement. So in case you're not familiar with the term of progressive enhancement, the idea is as follows. You ship a baseline functionality, and everybody picks always stairs as an example, so I'm rolling with this one too. So the idea is that you ship a baseline functionality, and then you ship some JavaScript or additional stuff on top to it, and then you have an enhanced experience. And if the enhancement fails, everything still works. So now I was traveling quite a little bit pre-COVID, and how often have you seen something like this in the wild? I have seen it more often than I would have loved to. And let me show you an example of a progressively enhanced website. So what you see here is Perf Tooling. This is something that I used to maintain, but I don't do anymore. So this is another collection of stuff because I don't like bookmarks. You see there that there's a search. You can type something in, it updates the URL, and then you can refresh. So what is happening here? This is a normal HTML form. And what it does is that it enriches the experience with JavaScript. So when you interact with the search form, it updates the search results below. It updates the URL bar. So when you now refresh, you get the same result because this is also server rendered. And in case every JavaScript is failing, you can still submit this form and you get to the same result. This works no matter what. Because at some point, JavaScript requests will fail. And when you're shipping something like on the scale of BuzzFeed, they monitored that just a little bit, and they found, or they saw that 30 million requests for JavaScript will just time out because there's always this big question mark in the middle, which is the network layer. Your JavaScript will fail eventually. And then there's this point where people say, well, nobody has JavaScript disabled, right? Which is not true because every user has JavaScript, is a non-JavaScript users until the JavaScript is downloaded, parsed, and executed. And another example that you probably use every day is github.com. So when you go to github.com, this still works. This is progressively enhanced. They have one endpoint there for posting comments, which handles an old school form submit, but also an AJAX submit. And they have some old school links on top. And I think this is beautiful. Is anyone bothered by this? No, because it just works. And they are not shipping a framework or a lot of JavaScript for that. I'm super, super duper happy with GitHub's experience because I think that a good site should just work. So when we think about the idea of progressive enhancement, what's the enhancement that we have out there in the wild? So before I show you the next slide, I don't want to pick on any framework too much. It's just I had to pick something here. So when we have a look at the React.js docs, what you see here is reactjs.org loaded on a fast 3G connection. And you can see there that the navigation is fairly snappy when you click on something after it is loaded. But let me show you the same thing with JavaScript disabled. So you load the whole thing and now you click around. And I would argue that the experience is more or less the same here. The difference is in what is actually loaded. So with JavaScript, reactjs.org, which is a static documentation site, loads uncompressed 1 megabyte of resources. Without JavaScript, it's only 175 kilobytes. And even after 4 navigations, the without JavaScript version is still much, much lighter than the other one. And I really don't want to nitpick on anyone here or doing something that someone is doing anything terrible here, because I am guilty of that too. I did that for years because I wanted to use cutting edge technology. But does that approach really improve user experience? I'm not really sure about that anymore. but I can be really sure that sometimes it's harming user experience. So what you see here is a screenshot of my phone, and I was in the Ukraine at the time, and this is in German. I will translate it in a second. So what my mobile provider basically tells me there is, Stefan, you get 6 megabytes for €2, but you have to use it in 24 hours. This is a joke. The average website today is 2 megabytes already. And now think about this. I'm in a foreign country, I probably don't speak the language, and I need some information. And now this website is 2.5 meg heavy. Then it's definitely harming my user experience at that moment in time. And when you go to HTTP Archive, so this is a website that monitors the state of the web, you will find out that websites are just growing and growing and growing. And we reached now the point of a website that is 2 megabyte heavy for displaying some content, which I think is surprising. And depending on where you live in the world, you also have to consider that people, depending on where they live, they pay different amount of money for data. So for example, I was once in Canada and mobile plans are just very expensive there. And they care about light websites because they're paying so much money. So depending on where you are in the world, web performance matters more than you might be aware of. So what we do very, very often in 2019 and 2020 is that we ship more data for the same experience. And maybe, just maybe, app frameworks should be for apps after all. I mean, Facebook is building React. And Facebook, I have no insights about the internals, but I would assume that this is an overly complex application. Or I'm also personally, I'm a Gmail fanboy. I think Gmail is a beautiful piece of software. But let me tell you something about Gmail. Gmail is 5 megabytes heavy. This is quite something. The cool thing about Gmail, though, is that when I sit in the trains, it's the Deutsche Bahn, is the service called here in Germany, I can also go for the low-end version, which works without JavaScript. And look at this. This is 40 kilobytes. This is what I care about when I'm on a spotty connection, when I'm paying a lot of data, because I just want to read and send emails. This is beautiful. So when you look how the distribution of libraries is today, you will find out that it always feels like everything is built with the views, the Reacts, the Svelters, the Angulars. But at the end, the majority of the websites out there is still running on jQuery. And this doesn't have to be a bad thing necessarily. And when you look at the framework distribution, you will see that React and Vue are not as popular as it feels in the Twitter sphere. The web is really not as cutting edge as it seems. And I think that now I have a new baseline for myself. And I think that boring is usually beautiful and it is fast. Another benefit that comes with universal JavaScript frameworks is that we are allowed, or we can do client-side routing. And this comes with a burden too, because when you do client-side routing, you have to re-implement and you have to fix accessibility. Additional to that, you have to, first of all, implement a lot of spinners, right? This is how we navigate the web today. We just see a spinner there, spinning there, but the navigation itself is super snappy. But what you have to consider is when you just update the URL is that you're basically breaking the accessibility that the browser gives you for free. So if you're running a client-side JavaScript framework to really make it work for assistive technology, for example, you have to do a few things. And the friends at Gatsby did a really nice user research about this. So you have to do two things. You have to, first of all, provide a skip link so that people can navigate what just happened. Because for assistive technology, it's very hard when you just replace the DOM. And then you have to include an area live region that basically tells the person that just clicked a link, hey, everything changed here, by the way. This is a lot of work that we have to be aware of when we go client-side routing. And maybe it's not needed. On my blog, I use client-side routing to do this transition from one page to the other. I'm not sure how many people actually enjoyed that. And I'm not sure about the value it brought. There's one case though, where I think that client-side navigation is preferred. It is preferred for experiences like this. Beautiful UI that does something that makes you smile because it's just nice and fun to interact with the website. And this is possible with the web today. So what you see here is a prototype by Sarah Dresner. This is built in Vue. I think it's beautiful. I would love to see interactions like this when I browse the web. But this is not what we're using client-side navigation for. We usually do a little transition from A to B and replace the DOM. And even Ryan Florence, who is the co-author of React Router, once said that there's a chance that he believes that client-side routing is usually not preferred. And he's a big part of this whole ecosystem. But there are also cool examples out there. So for example, when you go to the Vue.js documentation, you will find out that Vue.js.org is not using client-side navigation because they found out that the navigation with setting HTML is as snappy and is more accessible. And I think that is a super nice approach because a great site just works. And to make a site or to build a site that just works, I still believe, maybe this will change in 10 years, but today I still believe that developers have to know the foundation of the web, which is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And a great site can be built with, a great site doesn't have to be built with React, Vue, or Angular. And these conversations about technology choices should, when someone asks you, hey, I want to build a new site, what should I use? Our answers shouldn't necessarily be, you should use framework X with server-side rendering, a service worker, because everything needs a service worker these days, and it has to run in a Cloudflare or an Edge worker. I think the answer should be, like with so many things in development, it depends. What do we want to do? A great site can be built with React, Vue, and Angular. But the technology choices don't matter that much after all, I believe, because a great site is accessible and fast and secure. This is what it is about. And I would love to get rid of this idea of it's just HTML. HTML by itself defines over 100 elements. The HTML input element has 22 types. HTML is still evolving. What you see here is the enter key hint attribute on an input element. This is cool stuff. You can change how the submit button looks on a virtual keyboard. Chris Coyer from CSS Tricks wrote a 4,000-word article comparing links and buttons. And still, this is the markup that we find out there sometimes. This is inaccessible markup, which shows clearly one thing, that HTML is not easy. And when you look at comparisons or stats, for example, what you see here is WebAIM. They do a yearly state of the web kind of thing. And you see there that there are a bunch of websites that have common accessibility errors. You see there that there are problems like low contrast text 85%, missing alt text on images. These are kind of the things that are foundational for a good and well-running website. And you will find out that websites that ship with a JavaScript framework usually perform a little bit worse. And this is not the JavaScript framework's fault. But at the end, when you think about the complexity that you're shipping, it just makes sense because you have to deal with so much more things. You have to learn so much more things. Of course, it gets a little bit harder. So this is the 1 million report from WebAIM. And with the recent version, they said that 98% of websites that they checked had detectable WCAG, which stands for Web Community Accessibility Guidelines, had some errors in there. Overall, we're doing not a great job as an industry. And then there are these kind of news where a third party gets hacked and hundreds of sites mine cryptocurrency. How can that happen? While we have something that can prevent this. So what you see here is a header for content security policy. And with this, you can nail down what is allowed to be loaded in your website. And when you have a look at how many websites out there actually use CSP, it also doesn't look great. And when we analyze how much stuff on JavaScript we ship, you see there, for example, that 80% of the JavaScript libraries that we have there have some vulnerability or another in there. I feel like that the web overall loses quality. But hey, at least developers get more productive. And it all kind of started with Node and NPM, which started to bring up this whole JavaScript and front-end development ecosystem. And now I deployed my first service with Heroku. We now have Vercel and we have Netlify. And now for 2 years, 3 years, we have serverless functions. This is freaking cool. This is what it takes to build an HTTP endpoint. I can deploy a function with 3 lines of code or with 5 lines of code, and I just built myself an API. I think this is super exciting. And we have a lot of services out there going from analytics, content providers, Firebase for other content. Everything is out there. Everything has free plans. Everything is ready to use. You can build a product in a few days. And the options here are limitless. But at the same time, we went from an hello world, which was very light and not complex, to a hello world that was way, way heavier. But the damaging or the sad part about this is that it's just way, way harder to manage all these kind of things. And when you once installed or once you had dependency errors in your node modules, you probably know what I'm talking about. When you're chasing dependencies and something is broken and something is relying on something. And for what are we doing that actually for? So when I look at tiny helpers, what I did, so it's built with 11t, but I provided a little npm script so people can clone the repository and can do npm run helper add. And then there's a little questionnaire in the terminal, and then they can add a helper to the site. And a person wrote me, rightfully so, was like, Stefan, I had to download 700 megabytes of Node.js stuff to add a JSON file to this GitHub repository. Is that the right approach? So when I look forward, it's always also a little bit about how do you maintain websites. I bet with you that the person that still blogs on this website only uses a text editor, and probably person FTPs it up somehow. For the site that I was building, what I need is I need a text editor, I need a recent node version, I need an npm version, I need to have framework knowledge. I cannot drop something like this to another developer because he or she maybe doesn't have the knowledge or the ecosystem or everything on their machine to deal with this. So Josh Camo, he writes good stuff. So when we do the Twitter shout outs, you should definitely follow him. He once said that I've been building for the web for 15 years and it has never been so easy to build complex apps. And I 100% agree with this, but I want to question how many sites actually do need to be complex apps? And where are we going with this trend? So when I started, it was like this. It was some PHP, it was some jQuery, it was a database somewhere in the server. Now we're kind of here, and this list is far away from being complete. We're dealing with the foundation, but then we're dealing with framework levels, with build tools, with cloud providers. It just gets more complex. And it feels like complexity is king. And I want to question, what are we doing that for? So now when I was building the Tiny Helper side project, I started off with Preact. And I had it server rendered and it was running in a function. And then I had some state problems because I was like, how do you do this? And at some point, I talked to Jason Miller, who is the maintainer of Preact. And we discussed a little bit if Preact was actually needed for this use case. And the use case was really just a hamburger menu button that should do display block and display none. So we kind of agreed on the point that ideally at some point, the build tooling and the chains that we have could kind of also make a decision of, hey, do you need the framework in this case? And drop it if it's not needed. Because in that case, even lightweight Preact, which is a React alternative, was overkill what I wanted to do. What I ended up with was 16 lines of handwritten JavaScript, and this is all the functionality included on the site. I don't need a framework for that. So maybe we will have good enough abstractions one day, but today I still think that it is important that we know the web fundamentals to create the best user experience. And depending on where you work, you also have to remember that with the technology choices that you make, you're shaping tomorrow's job market. For example, at Contentful, we have chosen Angular 1 like 5 years ago. Make your technology choices wisely, because migrating from one thing to another is extremely costly and painful going forward. And I really want to believe that my job as a web developer is to build beautiful experiences and websites. Unfortunately, I don't think that this is the case, because our job as web developers today is to decide what tools to use, to decide what frameworks to use, to decide what to prioritize, and then to find out how to actually maintain all this complexity. Chris Coyer also shared that he was talking to a front-end developer who was doing that for 3 years, and the person got asked to build a website, and the person didn't know how, because we are so far away from the foundation that is actually included in a website. Because we're dealing with the foundation, with frameworks, with build tools, with cloud providers, and whatever is in there. And for front-end developers, it feels like that we're entering a stage where front-end developer is not enough as a job description anymore. Because we now deal with two camps of developers. We deal with the JavaScript-focused developers, which do maybe GraphQL, maybe they are Webpack experts. And then we're dealing with kind of maybe UX developers that care about performance, UX, accessibility. I think that most likely it's time to drop the idea of a front-end developer and maybe come up with better terms that describe what we actually need. And then we have to figure out who we're actually building things for. And we shouldn't build things for ourselves to have fun and to feel like great engineers, because our customers or users usually don't care. Your users and my users don't care about technical implementation details. They care if a website is great or not. And I believe that we as developers are paid to ship a great user experience. But I think over the last few years, we lost track a little bit, and we value developer experience a little bit more than the user experience. So to close this whole thing, I'm wearing a JavaScript hat, right? I love shiny tools, and I love writing JavaScript, and I love all the great stuff that we have. But maybe we should take a step back, and we should maybe start considering the right tools for the best user experience. So I mentioned my own site, and I rebuilt it in this year. So what happened? I went with 11t just because it was just trending. This is how it looks like. It looks more or less the same. But what happened? I reduced the overall page weight by 64%. The build time on Netlify reduced from 4 minutes to 40 seconds. I don't have a JavaScript pipeline, which I think is beautiful and refreshing. So there's way less complexity in there. When I need JavaScript functionality, I ship custom elements. So you see there a time ago component that is maintained by GitHub. And I wrote this Web Vitals component. If you want to show like some performance stats, you can just drop that in and it just works. And I joined the club of the anti-JavaScript JavaScript users, because I just question when I need complexity to provide a good user experience. And my site now has a pretty green lighthouse score with a better user experience. So is a JavaScript stack really that bad? No, not at all. And I still love all this technology, but maybe we should focus more on building sites than just work, and less on the technology to build these. If you want to have a look at the slides, they are on My Links Online, and I always have to point out that I own this domain, mylinksonline / did we lose direction. And I'm Stefan, I work for Contentful, and thank you everybody for listening.
Woo-woo. Nice, thank you. I think you underlined there some very, very interesting ideas and very useful, topics for debate for the web community, at least.
Well, thank you.
Do we have any questions from the audience? You can write them down. You can unmute yourself and ask them whatever works best. Meanwhile, maybe I have one question. So a lot of these ideas, I think, are, so you kind of start seeing these ideas popping up everywhere, with the Jamstack movement, with kind of like going back to the roots, some sort of a way of moving the whole JavaScript community back to, building simple websites or websites on simple tools. What about, you mentioned about the workforce. What about the people that are learning today? This is one of the, I think, toughest things that you have to consider, that people join the community today and they have kind of these two options. They either go and they learn, for example, they jump to some framework, they jump to React or Vue, which is considered one of the easiest frameworks to pick up, right, for beginners.
Yeah.
And they have like tons of materials on that, But if people want to stick with the basics first, how do they do that? Because that for me is usually it's harder to recommend to someone.
Yeah, I think in at least what I see here in Berlin and maybe even in Europe, I think right now it is not possible, right? If you want to start, because the industry moved for the front-end developers into this direction. If you want to get a job, you have to start somewhere, and learning HTML is probably not the thing that gets you a gig, right? I think the important piece is that, and I feel like that with the Jamstack movement and with hopefully coming a little bit of a change, I really much like this idea of splitting the term into different, or the area front-end development into several areas. And I feel like if we as an industry could change to people that care more about the basics and shipping good stuff and actual JavaScript engineers, if we could make this change as an industry, I think that we then could kind of also flip the problem, right? Because right now it is also like you need, for example, you need to know framework ABC to get a job. And then you get the job, and of course you're missing the foundational knowledge. I think to fix the gap, especially in education, we have to change the industry first, because there's nothing wrong with learning React first, if that is needed to enter the industry. So I feel like it's an industry problem more than an education problem. And I don't have an answer other than we have to start somewhere and kind of going a little bit back to the roots.
Yeah. I think there's a question in the chat there. Do you want to read it, or do you want me to read it?
These key points should make their way into human resource department. Don't you think? Oftentimes decisions on stack are bespoken for you long before the actual job. Yeah, I think so I only can give my experience from the companies that I've worked at. If the company is a little bit bigger, technology choices are usually considered for the whole company. So if I just talked to a friend a few days ago, and they built something with a framework that nobody knows, and they were just like, what is this? And of course you will have troubles hiring for that, right? Because if you want to have experienced engineers and or beginner engineers, and let's just pick React again, experienced engineers want to play with cool tech. They don't want to deal with outdated stuff. So you will have a shortage there. And the beginner engineers will probably know something that is very popular. So you have to, from an HR, recruiting, or human resource perspective, you have technology choices are definitely part of that. I'm not sure if I just rambled here. I'm not sure if I answered any question here, but.
Any other questions?
I have one. So is there maybe an in-between these two? Because it feels like very much kind of two-sided, either one or the other. But I'm not sure if there is like an in-between solution that we could, take some things into account.
I think the in-between is where we are slowly figuring it out. So for example, there are these, so over the last half year or something, I'm playing around a lot with Next.js, because I think the development experience is just beautiful. So they are nailing down a lot of things. It's just nice. So it comes with this very beautiful chain. It just works. Developer experience is great. But just a month or two, they added this JavaScript, so this non-JavaScript mode, so that developers can actually want to play with the latest and greatest. But for a content side, you can still disable this. And I feel like that slowly but surely this enters the framework world, so that we maybe can meet in the middle, which is like beautiful tools, easy handleable, great developer experience, but not necessarily 500 kilobyte bundles for rendering 500 words. And feel like, so what I see is, it feels like that we're slowly maybe shifting a little bit, and I would love to see that happening.
Makes sense. Thanks.
You mentioned there in one of the slides that we kind of need to sideline the concept of a front-end developer, and someone also put it here in the chat. What do you think about the full stack developer nowadays?
Well, I've met very, very good full stack developers. I'm overwhelmed with the front end part already. So I'm a little bit skeptical about the term, but sometimes I really do meet people and they're like, oh yeah, I set up my Postgres database and I scale it in AWS. And while I do this, I use hipster JavaScript framework and build something with ABCD. And I'm like, holy, I'm far away from being that person.
But sometimes it's really hard to explain even to the, let's say, product owners, product managers, that, okay, he's going to work on the front end for our application, but actually I'm doing the back end as well, and I'm going to touch the database. So it comes easily, and I use it like I'm doing full stack. I'm doing the front end and the back end, and I'm connected to the database. I think that's why it's sometimes, because I'm not, she many times it happened to me. She presents me as a front-end developer, but I'm not doing just the front end. I'm doing the back end and all the other stuff that needs to be done. I think that's why we're using the term, because front end doesn't explain my job, what I have to do.
Yeah.
Full stack JavaScript, it's more compromising of the front end and the back end and all that line.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, I think you have to run, right? But
yeah, my boss is waiting in a meeting in 1 minute.
I guess if you have other questions, feel free to chat with Stefan, maybe on Twitter or.
Twitter works, email works too. You will find that somewhere online too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
it was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much. It was really nice. And yeah, see you all next time at our next meetup, which will come in 2 weeks, but I'm not saying anything else for now.
Cool. Stay safe and have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Bye.